It has been over a year since the Book of Boba Fett streamed onto Disney Plus, a show I was looking forward to immensely at the time, but it received a mixed response overall, and looking back on all 7 episodes in retrospect, was the show actually worthwhile? In my eyes, the title alone screamed potential, the keyword being book. What chapters of this legendary bounty hunter's life could we possibly explore? His past on Camino, his service to the Empire? Nope. Sand. Just sand. Season 2 of The Mandalorian set the bar extremely high for live action Star Wars, and Boba Fett was confirmed to be alive. Mando Season 3 is just around the corner, where we have some concerns raised about the lack of continuity within the Mando show. Why is Grogu back? Season 2 had a poetic ending for this adorable character, but obviously they had to bring him back. But in Boba Fett's show? Jon Favreau spoke about this decision in a recent interview for Empire magazine, and in short, he essentially didn't want Season 3 to begin with a hard reset, so he ensured the reunion of Mando and Grogu was done elsewhere. Also, the fact that money talks, there was no way Baby Yoda was being left out of this series, and so Book of Boba, by the end, was basically Mando 2.5, and although some moments were very enjoyable, I feel this spin-off has a lot less going for it in comparison. Maybe expectations were set too high, leaving a mixed response to this renewed incarnation of Boba Fett, but after rewatching most of the show and skipping through certain bits, I thought we'd look back on this project, which parts were done well, and where did this show fail to deliver in comparison to other live-action Star Wars projects. Stranger in a Strange Land is a slow start to the show, where the first 4 episodes split the story into 2 halves. We have the present-day Boba rising to power as the new crime lord in place of Jabba the Hutt and Bib Fortuna, and these scenes show promise but ultimately under-deliver in my eyes. And with some moments of Fett healing himself using a personal back-to-tank, the rest of the story is set using flashbacks after Return of the Jedi, leading into the Mando Season 1 timeline. And one piece of lore I feel everybody was looking forward to seeing was Boba's escape from the Sarlacc pit.
I don't mean to be a prick, but you two guys have got to get the out of here.
I find it interesting how many years later, George Lucas himself expressed regrets for killing off the character in the original trilogy. And in the expanded media for Star Wars, which is now written off as Legends, Boba's escape from the Sarlacc pit is a fantastic story. Making the escape and then being nursed back to health by Dengar of all characters was something I was really hoping to see in live action. They could have even brought back Simon Pegg, who voiced Dengar in the animation and the video games, to play the disfigured bounty hunter. Instead, the escape was short-lived, but it still connects itself to the storyline established in Mando, and we see Jawas stealing the acid-burnt armor from Fett, leaving him to die in the desert, or eventually the Tusken Raiders take him away, and I like the conflict in this part of the story, where Boba's attempts to escape ultimately lead him to becoming part of the Tusken tribe. Another one of my favourite contributions was the droid 8D8 making a comeback. His appearance in Return of the Jedi was minimal, but I appreciate how the droid was repurposed in this show. Voiced by British comedian Matt Berry, this felt more organic to the story, rather than just throwing in a random new character. More familiarities were provided thanks to the Gamorrean guards and obviously the Sand People. Old characters are great, but new characters that help flesh out the story are just as important. And unfortunately for several new characters, they leave a lot to be desired. Seeing an empowered Boba on the throne is what a lot of fans were looking forward to, but what was out of place is for someone to walk into the room and belittle this characteristic. This male Twi'lek is a laughable attempt at a light-hearted character. He walks all over Fett, which sadly becomes a common theme throughout the majority of this show.
With apologies.
Tamara Morrison raised an interesting point behind the scenes about his character, exclaiming that Boba spoke too much. On set, he even confessed to passing several lines of dialogue to Ming-Na Wen, who plays Fennec Shand, and a lot of the online criticism boils down to Boba spending too much time out of the helmet. He's accused of becoming soft rather than morally grey like he was in the expanded universe. These criticisms aside, a lot of the creature designs remain consistent, and I like seeing new variants of the Sand People in particular, especially with how much attention they've been given in recent years. And this new cantina in particular made for some fun cameos, including Max Rebo, alive and well. And Jennifer Beals is, well, you know how it goes with Twi'leks.
Ooh.
This Ray Harryhausen tribute also made for an interesting spectacle to conclude the episode. Like several, it took me out of the Star Wars world briefly seeing this creature, but I can appreciate the efforts behind designing a creature of this scale, something new for the screen, and Boba saves the young Tusken, and is then celebrated as a hero, earning the respect of the tribe. Out of the Boba-centric episodes, The Tribes of Tatooine was by far the most consistent. It was full of moving character progression for Boba, matched with a Western-inspired train heist. And we are also introduced to the main villains for this season, giving us an expansion to the Pike Syndicate in live action, of which the Pikes have appeared in live action before, such as in the Han Solo movie, but for those unfamiliar, this crime cartel was mainly featured throughout the Clone Wars cartoon, fleshing them out as a rival gang who have quite the reputation. With Boba taken in by the Tusken Raiders, he essentially becomes one of their tribe, and you can see his emotional connection grow, becoming protective over the tribe. Several laughs are gained from the communication barrier between these characters, which does work in favor of humanizing these once savages. Looking at the Pikes, they are known for their criminal activities, now moving spice across the sands of Tatooine, and posing a threat to Boba. If we take his plan of becoming the new daimyo seriously, it does work in his favor to eradicate any threat to becoming successful. And he is also challenged by the Hutt crime family, where we meet Black Chrysanthemum in live action, and I felt this story really was going somewhere, but ultimately it fell apart very quickly. With this episode being slightly longer, it does take its time showing Boba's methodical planning. He trains the Sand People, steals speeder bikes, he even creates a group attack strategy, all of which leads to a fantastically filmed heist sequence. And there was a lot to appreciate from this episode, but one thing that seemed to go over a lot of people's heads was the cameo of Cammy and Fixer from Toshi Station. For those unaware, such as myself at the time, these characters were featured in a deleted scene from A New Hope, and were written to be Luke Skywalker's best friends. Building up the suspense, it was great to see the Sand People working closely with Boba, where they collectively bring the train to a stop. They stop a large shipment of spice from being moved across the Dune Sea, and building on this incarnation of Boba's character, his merciful act of allowing the Pikes to live is somewhat questionable. He instructs them to walk back to Mos Eisley, which seemed fair, but a lot of criticism seems to fall on Boba being too lenient with his so-called enemies. With a very psychedelic ending to this episode, I do have mixed feelings on Boba literally tripping balls on lizard acid. It sparked mixed messages about his character, where the Vision looked as though it was exploring Boba's very own psyche by citing old memories, and its visuals connoted a sense of entrapment, where he is perhaps trying to seek clarity about where he belongs in the galaxy. With how much I enjoyed the second episode, The Streets of Mos Espa is a huge disappointment, and is arguably the worst episode of this show. Its slow pacing and uninspired characters seem to undo any progression given to Boba himself. He takes action as the new daimyo by showing his skills as a leader, recruiting street thugs to do his bidding, cleaning up the streets by employing those committing petty crime. In theory, this works, but these characters caused a lot of controversy. I do respect the creators for trying something new, but this gang, known as the Mods, feel incredibly out of place, and it's a shame, because the concept on paper does sound like something you will perhaps find on a junk planet like Tatooine, having people reject their organic structure in favor of cybernetic augmentation. And we've seen stuff like this before with characters like General Grievous in the Clone Wars, and I feel if executed well, this could have been an interesting narrative, later linking with Fennec's survival. And I've seen many try and rationalize where these characters could perhaps fit into the Star Wars universe. Coruscant, maybe? With their unusually colourful speeders, the reaching continues, drawing comparisons to stuff such as George Lucas's film American Graffiti, which I don't really feel having something like this in a different show or film is a reference. It's more of just a generic comparison. These characters were used in arguably the worst scene in Star Wars television. Chasing down Mr. Apology himself, who is trying to flee Boba Fett, the male Twi'lek is quick to escape, riding off on a speeder, where the pursuit begins with some of the laziest camera shots where each scene just feels so constrained. And so, riding their multicolored mobility scooters, the wannabe geriatrics band together and try to stop Asshead from fleeing Mos Espa. And although I hate this scene and everything it stands for, the memes are fantastic. One aspect of this episode I did feel was worthwhile was the full usage of Chrysanthemum. Originating as a comic book character for some of the Darth Vader issues and I believe continuing on to the Dr. Aphra series, it was a pleasant surprise to see him, but his usage did leave a lot to be desired. I really do like the idea of him sneaking into Jabba's palace with the intent on killing Boba, but the fight was so sloppy, really poorly filmed, making a mockery of this brutal killer Wookiee who was then captured and held prisoner in the Rancor pit. And speaking of which, the show apparently needed a Rancor, and so gifted by the Hutts, some minor lore is given to this very iconic beast, but otherwise, having the Rancor only serves as a plot device for the finale. Danny Trejo briefly cameoed in this episode, but his character didn't really serve too much of a purpose. Generally speaking, this episode is a huge disappointment. I found one unflawed redeeming plot point, and it's where we see past Boba returning to the Tusken Raider camp to find that they have all been slaughtered, and this scene is so emotionally compelling, adding a slight complexity to his character and showing how much he really adored this new family and what they meant to him. With a slight return to form, this next episode, The Gathering Storm, was more light-hearted and more character-focused, but still fails at improving Boba Fett. In the present-day timeline, Boba hosts a dinner party with the largest crime bosses on Tatooine, where his intention is for them all to remain neutral without siding with the Pikes, and sadly, there's very little payoff for this scene, which does happen by the finale, where essentially all of these characters end up betraying him. Back in the past, we see a brief continuation from The Mandalorian Chapter 5, which was Fennec's first ever episode, and she has slowly become one of my favourite modern Star Wars characters. I appreciate how she went from deadly assassin and then turned to a loyal right hand to Boba. And adding to the chronological timeline, we see Boba find Fennec left to die in the sand, where he takes her to a literal repair shop. And once again, we see the mods very briefly, who are responsible for saving Fennec's life by making bodily modifications. We knew about this from Mando Season 2, but not how it happened. Once again, the handling of the scene, which is important to both Boba and Fennec, does unfortunately feel tarnished by characters who don't really belong in my eyes. And I was very surprised to see Thundercat in this show, a musician I genuinely really like, and his style does fit in with the mods, but the mods don't really fit into Tatooine in my eyes, so it makes it difficult to fully appreciate his character. Taking the necessary steps to secure his property back, Boba needs two things: his armor and his iconic ship, the Slave One. And in recent years, an unusual debate has occurred about renaming Boba's ship. As a child playing the LEGO Star Wars games, I knew this ship as Slave One.
With the new LEGO Star Wars Slave One.
In the Clone Wars cartoon, the name is spoken aloud. Toys, LEGO models, a lot of them released under Disney. The name continued as it should have, Slave One. Recently, the name was changed when LEGO released a microscale set depicting a moment from Mando Season 2, and from then onwards, this ship has been known simply as Boba Fett's Starship. Nothing official has been announced by Disney about this to my knowledge, but I know a lot of fans are displeased about the idea of the name being censored. I guess just in case it's viewed as insensitive, but considering the franchise has dealt with sensitive subjects such as slavery anyway, I view this change personally as unnecessary, and they are compensating for something that may cause an issue later down the line. Getting back on topic, Boba and Fennec enter Jabba's palace and steal the Slave One, and surprisingly, a lot of these scenes were pretty fun, seeing the interior of Jabba's palace, along with some interesting droid characters. I loved seeing the little bunny-style droids in live action from the Clone Wars, and reunited with his ship, the pair do escape where Boba finally enacts some form of revenge on the Sarlacc, along with a speederbike gang he suspects killed his newfound family of Tuscans, and this concludes the episode where Boba is now fully healed from the Bacta tank, making comment on how they now must prepare for war with the Pike Syndicate.
Hey, look, everyone, it's Mando!
Bryce Dallas Howard delivers on an incredible episode of Star Wars television with the return of the Mandalorian. And although simplistic and basically just a Mando episode spliced into Book of Boba, the execution of this story made it all the more enjoyable. I wish this was a feeling consistent across the entirety of this show. This story reinforced just how important style and cinematography becomes for a big budget television series such as this, and with some of the unwanted scenes that we got, this definitely blew certain episodes out of the water. Mando is reintroduced within the first few minutes, where we are given iconic quotes, the darksaber, and even some gory action details, and I love the usage of this long take camera shot in particular, where it remains smooth and uninterrupted, and departing from Tatooine is a much needed breath of fresh air for this series, and something frequently mentioned as a constraint of the show. Visiting this Halo-like world, Mando is provided with the secret location revealing where the Armorer and Paz Vizsla are hiding, and one aspect that remains consistent throughout is how symbolism works in favor of Mando's character. Showing and not telling is a golden rule acknowledged throughout, and his actions and small bursts of dialogue connote heavy amounts of storytelling. His fight with Paz Vizsla in particular shows the struggle with remaining true to the Mandalorian faith, and providing even more progression, Mando sacrifices the spear that he got from the Ahsoka episode, where he turns it into a set of chainmail armor for Grogu, and this shows just how much the little guy means to him. He even wraps it in a bundle shaped like his head, showing that he misses him, and even seeing this child Rodian on a public transport shows just how lonely Mando must be feeling having given up the kid. We see how much impact Grogu has had on Mando as a character, such as how he is able to move on and get a new ship as an example, which I love this remade version of the Naboo starfighter from the prequels, and how Mando seems to have moved on in other aspects, such as how he used to despise droids, but from what he has gone through, such as fighting alongside IG-11, he seems to value droids a lot more. There's a small BD droid helping with the construction, where Mando actually thanks him and sort of recognizes him as an individual. And so, resetting Mando going into the third season is a fairly straightforward process: new ship and a new objective. Having removed his helmet, he is no longer considered as part of the Mandalorian faith, and the only way he can seek forgiveness is to visit the planet Mandalore, giving Din Djarin a destination. What this episode appears to reinforce is how Boba boils down to nothing short of a plot device. His presence on Tatooine is supposed to deliver new leadership, which must be earned at the cost of eradicating the Pike Syndicate, and so he has Fennec Shand enlist Mando to help win their fight, and what Boba doesn't realize is there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. Like many, this chapter was my personal favorite. It's just a shame the best episode of Boba's show doesn't even feature him, but I just like to pretend this is Mando 2.5, a side quest. From the Desert Comes a Stranger is another favoured episode, but Boba is once again reduced to nothing short of a cameo in his own TV show. And so, following up on Mando being recruited for Boba's fight, there is something he must attend to first. That being Grogu. Essentially, this becomes the cameo episode, offering as much fan service as possible. Cobb Vanth, R2-D2, Grogu, Luke Skywalker, Ahsoka, and my personal favourite, Cad Bane. This scene alone was jaw-dropping, and for me was the best part of the whole show. From the wide-angle long shot on the Western-inspired music, this further strengthens Bane's introduction. Seeing the cowboy silhouette on the horizon for the casual fan would mean very little, but for those familiar, they know how ruthless this bounty hunter is. Even in his old age, about 70 years old at this point, it's incredible to see him still kicking.
You should have never given up your armor.
Mando travels to a forest planet with the intention of visiting Grogu, where he finds a new Jedi Academy is being built, and this is where Ahsoka sneaks up on him, where she explains that his presence is dangerous and that it will distract Baby Yoda from learning the ways of the Force from Luke, and this is where we see Luke actually training him, with more flashbacks to Order 66 hinting at how he was perhaps saved during the Jedi Purge. And Mando decides to just leave the gift behind and doesn't actually get to see Baby Yoda. And not wanting to risk and disrupt the Jedi training, he returns back to Tatooine, where the confrontation with the Pikes is building further. And this is where we see Cobb Vanth deliver a threat that he could later regret that could cost him his life. And this hints at how Mos Pelgo, now known as Freetown, is inevitably going to be dragged into the conflict, and Boba needs soldiers, and Mando believes that they will help in their fight. And suddenly, this is where the characters are brought together discussing strategy, only for the Syndicate to make a move against Boba, bombing the Sanctuary Cantina. And when I first saw this, my immediate thought was, is Max Rebo okay, because I hope this was his day off.
Man, come on!
Fighting is now inevitable, where the episode concludes on Grogu being given a difficult choice: stay and become a Jedi, or return to the Mandalorian. In the Name of Honor is the grand finale, what everything has been building towards. And this was meant to be the ultimate showdown between Boba Fett, the Pike Syndicate, and intern Cad Bane. And I feel this episode delivers on Boba vs. Bane, but it lacks a necessary substance behind the additional characters that have been implemented. This conflict has been brewing for years in my mind, and for those unfamiliar, it's not the first showdown between these old foes. If you want to learn more, I would recommend checking out my videos covering the cancelled bounty hunter story from the Clone Wars. This episode and its execution becomes tiresome and repetitive, and it personally reminded me of those Walking Dead episodes where the survivors would fight the saviors. It was going somewhere, but it was drawn out with nothing but repetitive gunfire. And for a conclusive story, this felt empty and uninspired, with very little focus on what was most important: Boba Fett's personal conflict. And instead, this fight does bring everyone together, but the main focus is instead meant to be Mando and Grogu, and that's exactly what happens. Looking at the fight scenes in particular, there is good and bad in what we see, such as the usage of these droids, which were inspired by some concept art from Attack of the Clones, and I like how fighting the droids, Boba's literally riding the Rancor into battle, which is a fun homage to the original animated depiction of this character from 1978. What I'm not so pleased about is the usage of the Pike Syndicate now, which are basically reduced to being disposable, which goes against their ruthless reputation outside of this show. And when we see Cad Bane squaring up to the Rancor, which throws Boba off his back, this is where the confrontation is made into a fair fight, but even more damage than is caused by either of the droids, is caused by the Rancor getting out of control. Standing off against one another, Boba and Bane's dialogue exchange would make more sense if there was a more humble quality to Boba fighting for the people of Tatooine. His possessive mannerism of fighting for his people is really forced and carries very little weight behind it. He doesn't care about the people, he wants power. Throughout the previous episodes, there was no character-defining moment that suddenly changed his mind, where he would then fight for the people. This was all more about power than anything we have seen with Boba. He wanted a taste of what he had seen people that he had worked for actually have possession of, and he wanted to do a better job of having that power. This is made all the more ironic where the citizens of Tatooine have basically rejected his presence and ultimately walked all over him all season. And I feel this fight scene would make more sense if Boba was fighting to win the respect of the townsfolk. And as predicted, he does ultimately win the conflict, with some interesting dialogue reflective of that deleted Clone Wars cartoon. Bane toys with Boba's emotions, hinting that he was in fact responsible for killing the Tusken Raiders in Episode 3, and in one last burst of strength, having been floored by Bane's skill, Boba knocks his nemesis over and stabs him in the chest using the gaffy stick. Honestly, if this is the end for Cad Bane, I'll be extremely disappointed. And so, with the conflict having concluded, we get a very abrupt end where the town is rebuilding. Boba admits they are not suited to the lifestyle they have been living. Fennec cements herself as the superior assassin by killing off the last remaining villains, where Mando and Grogu disappear off into space, where we will catch up with them in The Mandalorian Season 3. Overall, this story serves two purposes in my eyes. It completely changes Boba Fett into an unrecognizable version of the man that he once was. Near death or old age has clearly given him a change of heart, and also, this show is a brief detour for reuniting Mando and Grogu. And outside of this, I feel like some of the ideas expressed within the show were good, but a lot of the content heavily relied on cameos, with this being a first step into a broad Star Wars television universe, which in itself is a good idea if executed properly. But this show felt very rushed, where polishing it could have perhaps made it into something truly spectacular. I feel less episodes would have definitely been a huge advantage. Telling this story in chronological order would have likely improved the build-up to a final confrontation for Boba with Cad Bane. But otherwise, we got what we got. It is what it is. I'm sure many out there have actually produced fan edits of this, and so perhaps that would be a more enjoyable viewing experience. Who knows? But anyway, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you did enjoy. If you did, be sure to leave me a like down below. Let me know what you think of this show in the comments. As always, I love to hear your thoughts and opinions. And for more content, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, DVD Review Studios.
Are you threatening me?